the pandemic has created across the board in every discipline and every way of thinking and every sort of cultural, systemic part of our reality globally, not just here in the Bay Area or Dallas or Toronto or Mexico, but globally. And so we kind of committed ourselves to sort of just opening up a set of conversations with really interesting, smart people to learn both about what they were going through and how they were thinking about the pandemic, and just to begin to see if there are places that we could begin to poke at that might make sense. Roger alluded to one of those, which is the sort of quantum mechanics and racism. Bringing those two worlds together wouldn't probably have happened otherwise. So we've given our space to have those sorts of conversations. So one of the things that we started talking about was, given the social unrest internationally, not directly as a result of the pandemic, but inclusive of Black Lives Matter, inclusive of all the protests that were occurring around the globe in different contexts for different reasons. If there was a way to begin to sort of take a snapshot of that or look at that in a robust way, it might open a window to a kind of portrait of the human condition as it sits today and perhaps tomorrow. And so this conversation kind of expanded into thinking about, well, how would we put together something that could begin to amalgamate all of the, say, protest videos that could be submitted on something like TikTok, and sort of weave all that material together in some interesting way. We then started talking about, then there's this all of the unfortunate victims of the pandemic. The 2.5 million plus people who have perished because of the pandemic. Where are the remembrances? How do you hang on to who these individuals are? And that obviously immediately brought forward the AIDS quilt as a kind of direct response to a similar situation, and opened again this connection back into the textile world, into the weaving world, into quantum mechanics and thinking about string theory, and then starting to thinking about knots and knot theory, and thinking about knitting and that just sort of kind of just went, wow, there's something here. There's something really important here. We need to talk to people who have firsthand knowledge in those and expertise in those areas, just to get a sense of who they are and what they're thinking. I found you, and who knew? You're in my backyard. I've been here for 40 years too. We've probably crisscrossed in some strange way, but I'm so glad, and when this is over, I can't wait to come visit you and see you personally, face to face in the studio, and see the work that you're doing. But from what I've been able to learn, you are the consummate knotist. And I, even as we're beginning to have this conversation, your hands are busy putting together this thing. So that's where I want to start. What are you making right now? What are you doing? What are you doing, and why are you doing it?
Yeah, I love that you want to start with the materials themselves, because in that way, as an artist, I'm a craftsperson. My approach is that of the craftsperson rather than, say, a graphic designer or an architect. And by that, I mean that I approach the craft, I'm materials driven. So I start with the materials first and listen to them and find out what they want to become. And in my case, they often want to become monumental, large pieces of fine art. Anyway, so what I've been making here, this is my favorite knot. It's called the 5-strand star knot. And so in the world of knotting, I'll tell you in a nutshell, there are more than 4,000 documented knots, and most of them were invented by sailors, and most of them are functional, although a significant meant to be decorative knots, but most of them have a function and were invented to do one thing and do it very, very well and nothing else. And, you know, you can really tell when you're talking to a real knotter because they understand that, you know, there's one knot that will be the right knot in any given situation and none of the rest will do. So long story short, knots are divided, because there are so many of them, we divide them into different families and subfamilies. And so the family of button knots are really interesting for me. Button knots originated as the knot that you might have on Chinese pajamas, you know, the soft knot made out of rope. We often call them frogs. And the reason that button knots came about is because it's very easy to sleep using in your pajamas on a knot made out of rope, whereas maybe a knot made out of bone or some sort of hard material would not be comfortable. So that's actually this knot, the Chinese button knot. And what distinguishes a button knot and the button knot family is that the line goes into the knot and exits in the same place, sort of like a flower stem. And then the knot sits on top of the beginning and ending, sort of like a flower. This is a really complicated knot. I learned it during my year of learning one new knot every day, and it brought me to tears the first time I tried it because it was so complicated. So that's what I'm making. But I have a lot of knots here that I've spread out that I might, you know, if should they come up in conversation, it might be fun to just sort of look at some. And you know, we could even learn to tie one if anyone has, you know, 10 feet of rope laying around. I could teach you how to do one.
Maybe we can get Nina into the conversation. Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Nina Tseglady. I'm also my third life. So my first life was I grew up in East Europe in communist Hungary. So that was my first life. Then I escaped. And then I had my second life when I was training both in science and in art. And I worked and I had children. I brought up 3 sons. And then I entered my third life, which is now when I'm living independently and working as an artist and a curator, mostly curator. And also I do all sorts of organizations and facilitations between different places and different people. And that's what I do. And I am very interested, like the latest exhibition I curated was all women artists who work, they're international and Canadian, who work with environment and the Anthropocene. And now I am working on a 3-year exhibition project which has to do with sensory perception.
Wow.
I work in different things, and that's it. I'm stuck now in Toronto. All my life I was traveling, and now I'm stuck.
I can't wait to Google you and see your work.
Oh,
Okay, Vanya, you want to jump in on knot theory in Mexico?
you got it.
Oh, Vanya.
Okay, I don't think I know a lot about knot theory. We do have traditional weavings, and I've also seen this new form of protest. I found a page on Facebook. It started with a Facebook page called Obras de Arte Comentadas, which is about like modern day art. And the curator of the page uploaded this kind of, I don't know how to call it, like this embroidery saying like there's no reverse racism. I don't remember, but it was kind of like that. And she tagged another page that was doing them. So it was like 5 in the morning, and I was like, wow, yeah. Seeing all of this, and this page, I don't remember the name, posts like galleries, like online galleries of women, mostly women, doing embroiderings and well, yes, embroiderings about revolutionary things, such as, I don't know, asking for legal abortion, saying these kind of things, such as racism, reverse racism doesn't exist. But what for me it's interesting is that we have Mm, we have some kind of graphics here in Mexico, like uh, specific to Mexico. For example, when a band or someone like a musician is going to be presenting somewhere, um, they use walls, like they paint them in white and then they write the name of the musician, but they use neon colors to write the name. So it's really kitsch, but it's really Mexican. So I've seen a lot of these embroideries using that type of like white canvas and
Oh,
the neon letters. I'm gonna Google them because I think it's really not hard to imagine, but it's really specific for me to tell you how it's done, and maybe I'm not making myself clear.
That's neon knots. Is that what it is?
No, I'm gonna need I'm gonna need to Google it.
Well, once you get that, Wendy, let me just inject, following up on Joel's comment about how we might do the equivalent of the AIDS quilt, but to remember all the people who are dying in the pandemic. And immediately I said, oh, how do you do a quilt in 4 dimensions, in 5 dimensions? And I said, oh, I know the world's expert on this. Her name is Linda Henderson in Austin, Texas. She wrote a very famous book that we helped her publish called The Fourth Dimension in Art and Science. And she's working on a new book right now. So then the question that I asked her is, how do you tie a knot in 4 dimensions? Well, unfortunately, sailors never did that, Windy, to my knowledge. They did not build 4 or 5 dimensional knots.
but someone recently did it. Someone recently did it. I'm wondering if that's what you're about to say.
No, who is it?
Some mathematicians, obviously. You know, there's not to derail what you're saying, but just very quickly, the sailor's knot and the physical knots, like the knots I'm tying, are related, but very distinct from the way mathematicians and scientists look at knotting. And they're both obviously equally interesting to me. Anyway, so the 4-dimensional knot that was tied was done by, I guess, mathematicians.
Okay, so the provocation is we do want to remember all the people dying in the pandemic. How might we create a higher dimensional AIDS quilt? And we don't know, and that's why we're reaching out to people like you to think aloud.
Yeah, 2 years ago, I did a project for National Geographic for their headquarters in Washington, D.C. And for that project, they wanted a suspended sculpture, and they wanted to incorporate using used, frayed, dirty climbing ropes by some of National Geographic's explorers. So that was a wonderful element that added meaning to the work. My point, though, is that so what I decided to do was make a 3-dimensional quilt. So not 4 dimensions, but 3. When you think about what we normally think of as sort of traditional quilting, it's cubes. It's squares, 2-dimensional, communally made, bringing in materials from all walks of life, old T-shirts, you know, anything really. It doesn't even really have to be fiber if you want to expand the definition of quilting, and make a quilt. So in my case, what I decided to do was use cubes and make a plane of cubes. So if you can imagine that, I did it communally with 5 people, and we each were responsible for our own cubes, and we strung the ropes within each cube in every permutation of 2 axes. Anyway, long story short, we ended up making a 3D quilt. I didn't really think about it as being a quilt or being communal until afterwards. And again, that's because my approach is always to look at the materials, think about what might be done with them, and then find the meaning in them later, and trust that my intuition, you know, has layered the meaning in there. Anyway, all that's an
I
aside
think that
to
you're making a very
the four-dimensional quilt. I don't know anything about 4 dimensions.
you're making a very
Go ahead.
important point about this dimensionality. But the in some ways I didn't really want to even use the term quilt because of this. You know, it automatically puts us into this framework of a cultural tradition, but also because the AIDS quilt has such a set of connotations already associated with it, its assembly and how it's put together, it could potentially be almost a bit misleading. And in fact, as one would imagine, there are tons of people out there right now trying to figure out how to build a quilt of the victims from the pandemic. And what we're really looking at is something perhaps, you know, more provocative than that, I guess I would say. But I think the processes that you're alluding to are really important. Like one of the first things I started looking in my home was looking around for knots, and they're everywhere.
They're
right?
everywhere.
I mean, they are everywhere, and
they're everywhere.
I never really thought about it that way, as a kind of fabric of life. And so I reached into my my desk and pulled this out because I'm sure this looks very familiar. And it's clearly not a knot, but it is kind of a knot, right?
No, it's not a knot.
Right, it's not a knot. It's
a tangle.
It's a tangle. And so can you talk about that for a second? The differences between tangle and knot, and the difference between entanglement? Yeah.
Oh, well, that's wonderful and metaphorical. I would say the definition of a knot is any complication in a length of line. And so the difference between that and your tangle there is intentionality. It's an intentional complication in any length of line. Why is that interesting? Well, I mean, knots are not things that happen because you crumpled up your AirPods in your drawer. Knots are product of human ingenuity, right? And knots have existed. They predate the use of fire, the use of the wheel. They are an ancient technology. And we humans invented them. So there's something really beautiful in that. And I also like to think of knots as a universal language. Like Vanya was mentioning, the embroiderers in Mexico and the sailor in South Korea, they can't actually talk to each other using the same language, but they all know the same knots. They may even have different names for the knots, but the knots are sort of agnostic in that way, right? And to Roger's point, they're not racist either. They contain no prejudice. They are perfectly designed objects.
Vanya, knots are not racist. Maybe at the end of the book, we can mention, oh, there's a different solution.
I mean,
knots are not racist.
Knots are not racist, and we all speak the language because we all tie our shoes every morning, right? So we're all knotters. When I
but let me just inject. And so do animals make knots?
Not unless they're intentionally doing it. A knot is an intentional complication in a length of line.
Can you teach an animal to make a knot?
You might be able to. I mean, we teach dogs to shape.
So I'm just challenging you with the term universal. Because a different provocation that we're working on with Jonathan Keats is how we create a new form of democracy where the animals and plants can vote too. So when you say knots are universal, I beg to correct you, they're not. They're specific.
Thank you.
They're specific to human animals. I don't know of any animals that make knots, but I'll have to do some Googling.
I'll have to as well. Roger, what do you think? You understand the sentiment I was trying to express. What word would you suggest I alternately use?
Shared anxiety.
Shared anxiety.
Vanya?
Okay, so I found the graphic I was telling you, but also we only have 1 minute left. So when we get taken out of of the meeting, just click on the same link I sent you, and we will rejoin in this meeting. It's just I don't have premium, so we have to do this.
Okay, so what the ritual is we end the meeting and begin it again.
Yeah.
Okay, before you do that,
I have, can I just say, I pay for Zoom, so I have an endless meeting, if that's helpful.
But then you have to let us all know.
There,
and then
I put it in the
Vanya
chat.
is recording it, so why don't we just do, so
Okay.
how much longer do we have on the Zoom, Vanya, right now?
1 minute.
Okay, so let me just leave an idea in your mind for when we begin again. We're trying to invent new rituals that provocateurs use. And so one of the rituals I'm proposing is, let us honor someone we know that survived the pandemic, but got the virus. And I have someone I'd like to honor when we begin the meeting again. So we're trying to invent new rituals that we use as part of the new cult.
I didn't see that, sorry.
The small ritual I'm proposing is that we remember people we know who have survived COVID-19. And the person I want to mention is Vint Cerf, who is the chief evangelist at Google. He and his wife got COVID-19 and have survived it. My wife and I are good friends with his family, and I'm just so happy he survived. And that's the end of my honoring of Vint Cerf. If any of you know Vint Cerf and would like to say 2 words, please say a few words about Vint Cerf. Are you recording, Vanya?
Yeah.
I'm so glad to hear that he survived. I'm friends with his son, Dave. You must know Dave, Roger.
Yeah, yeah. And part of the idea of this ritual is Vanya can then edit the honoring of someone who survived the pandemic, and then we can share it with that person. So this is just a practice run here, but we're trying to invent new rituals for the post-pandemic world. And so this is a micro proposal, micro provocation. Yes, we want to honor the people who died, but we also want to celebrate the people who survived COVID-19. Thank you.
Well, I don't know Vince or his wife. I know of them, and I'm really pleased to hear that they've worked their way through the trials and tribulations and are coming out the other side of this positively.
So I would like to get back to the knots, if it is a possibility. And I'm glad to get back to the language of the knots. And I'm asking this because I'm involved for a couple of years in a project which has to do with the quipus from Peru and Chile,
Mm-hmm.
and which is a language,
Mm-hmm.
actually. And I just wanted to know your opinion, because in my research, I discovered that originally quipus were only considered as an accounting device.
Mm-hmm.
And now it has been discovered that it has much more, that with quipus, they have been able to talk about history and politics in these words in Latin America. But I just wonder that with your knots and quipus, so what's anything relevant or anything which relates to that?
I mean, I think it's, I'm so glad that you brought them up. It's my understanding that also in China and in Hawaii, knots were used to keep accounts and for record keeping. And I love that you pointed out that it's more than just about numbers, right? It's about, when we think about record keeping, we are thinking about economics and class and how society, functions. So I think it's fascinating. It's kind of all I have to say about that. I mean, knots are there's actually a knotter from the 1960s who very delightfully decided to make an alphabet. So he made however many consonants there are in the English language, and then also identified some vowels with knots. And so in that way, you can actually write your name, you know, with a series of knots. So I could write Windy by writing or knotting W-I-N-D-Y. It's sort of a cute little folly, but a nice example of how we might also communicate with knots. And then when you think about, you know, some knots have sort of passed into lore, or, you know, have become metaphorically symbolic of other things. And so that's something that maybe is not always universal, but is something that, you know, we can play with the meanings when the meanings are sort of universally understood to be A, B, or C. For example, you know, to think of a very potent, difficult knot, we can think of the noose, right? So the family of nooses are a family of knots. Those are loop knots that constrict when tension is applied. You know, farmers use them on animals to pull them along, but of course we know that it has a very, very terrible history of being used on humans and Black Americans in the US. So that's just one really potent example, but there's so many knots that have, you know, very long histories behind them, that, and you can use them in that way as materials for what you might be wanting to say.
Thank you very much. That's very nice of you. Thank you.
One sentence you said, Windy, in the same sentence, you use the word knot and metaphor. Can you say that again? And
I can't.
Why?
I can't remember what I was saying about that. I mean, I think that one can use them metaphorically. I don't typically. Again, I'm a craftsperson and I start with the materials and I think about the meaning later, and there's often rich layers there, but it's not my starting point. But no, some people do.
But, well, and so, you know, then your next sentence was about the noose. And
yeah.
In Dallas, the noose means it's a knot that you use to kill Black people.
Yes, and that was my point. And so this is an example of a knot that has, go ahead.
So there, I think that's a very nice example of how some knots acquire metaphorical meaning.
Exactly.
And let me just finish that. The meeting I had before this was with a Chinese-American PhD student that I work with. She's applying metaphor theory to data visualization.
Oh.
And part of the discussion we had is how do different metaphors have different interpretations depending on the religion you believe in.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an atheist, she's a Christian. So we got into a discussion. I'm going to ask her about how you might apply knot theory to data visualization. And I have no idea whether anybody's already worked on that, but you know, the example you gave is so easy to explain in Dallas, Texas. What is a noose? It's a knot that you use to kill Black people with.
Yeah, yeah.
And you know, I'm now going to have to think about other knots which have a metaphorical meaning to them.
Well, let me give you some other examples if that's of interest.
Yep.
So there's a whole, let me see. Sorry, one sec. So there's a whole family of knots called bends. I mentioned that there are more than 4,000 documented knots. Bends are the family of knots that unite two lines.
Bend?
A bend. And we can use it both as a noun and a verb. We can say, I'm going to bend lines together to make a bend. And so bends are knots that unite two lines. This is a very classic example of a bend. This is called the double fisherman's knot. And it's what fishermen use to connect fishing line together. What's really nice about this knot for fishermen is that you can make it with very thin line and it can be wet and slippery and the knot will still hold its integrity and be secure. So that's what's really cool about it. But again, with the metaphor, you know, the idea of bringing two lines together and uniting them and connecting them permanently, that's a very rich sort of, you know, concept there. And there are literally hundreds and hundreds of different types of bends. So that's one example. I also wanted to point out another thing that's interesting with the differences between sailor's knots and mathematical knots. The difference is that in math, the knots do not have ends. In mathematical knot theory, we're talking about closed loops which lack ends. And the way that knots are identified in mathematics are by the number of crossings. So you can reduce a knot down, you know, even Joel's tangle there can be reduced to a number of crossings. There's probably 30 crossings in his. The lowest number of crossings you can have is 3. And so the knots that are simplified down to the least number of crossings possible in that particular loop are called prime knots, like prime numbers. Just some trivia there.
I never thought knots could be this interesting. Like, I don't think I know about them a lot. Like, the most close I've been to knots and weaving and this kind of stuff is that my mom makes some kind of crochet sometimes. So I didn't know it was so important to culture. Like, I don't think I have thought truthfully about knots, and this is really interesting.
Yeah, and you know what? I think that the reason you're saying that is because we don't notice all of the knots that are around us. Like, for example, I'm sure you have beautiful long hair, so you probably braid your hair. And
Yeah.
braiding is a kind of knotting. There's a whole family of braid knots called sinnets, which is also where the word knit comes from. So, you know, knots are all around us at all times.
Yeah.
Think about the way in the Jewish tradition, braiding the challah, right? Braiding the bread. That's also knotting.
Okay, I just wrote it down, and Nina's scowling at me for talking too much. But one of the areas that I'm interested in, because my father's PhD advisor was a man called Theodor von Karman, who was the first person to successfully apply mathematics to understanding turbulence.
Oh.
And it just occurred to me, the reason I just stood up is I have a fountain behind me, and it started making a lot of noise because it had tilted. And, you know, the water coming out of the fountain is like the equivalent of a knot. So, you know, maybe we can apply this idea about knots to understanding turbulence. How do you create a quiet knot rather than a noisy knot in water? You know, obviously Leonardo da Vinci spent a huge amount of time looking at turbulence in water. You know, how do you make the turbulence smooth and not knotted? Obviously, the last thing you want when you fly an airplane is the air behind the wing is very turbulent and knotted. You want it to be smooth. So suddenly now I'm applying knot theory to the idea of turbulence in our society. So as Joel was saying, or I forget, everybody across the planet is demonstrating throwing rocks and stones and so on. That's social turbulence. So how could we apply the ideas of knot theory to calm down the turbulence? Anyway, I'll stop there. Nina, please say something.
I want Joel to say something. Because this was his idea, this whole
Well, as I'm listening to all this, I you know, one of the things that Wendy, you said right from the outset was that, and I think this is, you know, comes from your orientation to the crafts tradition, which is that the materials speak to you. They sort of tell you what they want to become. And I know my friends and who are ceramicists, or they talk about the clay in the same manner. But I'm thinking about the digital, and thinking about might there be a way to think through how a string of digital artifacts can also speak to us in a way that would inform us as to how they want to be knotted, tied together, or you know, formed. And I really don't know. I mean, I've never really thought about like a data stream as a
I love this.
As a string you might tie a knot with.
I love this. I mean, so my first thought is to say, is maybe the easy answer, which is, speaking of data visualization, is to do something really graphically attractive and appealing with the data that one might collect. Some of us might be aware of the work of Edward Tufte, who is the famous data visualization person, right? And the not just the information that can be conveyed visually through graphics, but not just the information, but to do so in a really beautiful way can open up different pathways in the brain, right? The appreciation of beauty is a creative appreciation, much more so than intellectual. So there's that. But what's interesting about, you know, call it a 2D data visualization chart, the type of thing we see on the front page of the New York Times every day, that's not going to be helpful for what you're mentioning. So you're saying that some of the data you might be collecting might be audio, or it might be video clips. And so those are not necessary, those are not only, you know, those have a fourth dimension to them in that there is time involved, right? They change over time, the fourth dimension. So it's interesting to think about what a data visualization would be that would incorporate those material aspects of the data itself. And really, as a craftsperson, I would say that the data itself should suggest what the final form should be.
Yeah, it's a complicated thing to
Joel, I think we need to capture your idea there. So if you have several videos, how do you knot them together? Right, so you know, the videos are strings. How could you combine the 3 video strings applying one of Windy's knots? And I guess the answer is I don't know. And I don't know if anybody has taken 3 video strings and then how do you tie them together using one of these sailor's knots? I have no idea. Maybe someone's done it already.
Windy, have you invented a knot?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you, Joel. I have. And I'll tell you, it'll take about 2 minutes. I'll tell you the story of that happening. So during the year of knots, I was playing around with very classic knots. I started with the classics, and this is one of them. This is the very classic figure-8 knot. Many of us are familiar with it. I've done it with a loop here, but the shape, the structure is the same. It's a figure-8. Yeah, everyone knows this one? So as I was playing with it, I was introduced to the concept of the multiple figure-8. So instead of one 8 pattern being made, we make multiple 8 patterns. And what that looks like when you actually execute it is this.
Wow.
This is a multiple figure, and you can see that the 8
Vanya,
pattern,
you can tie your hair into a double knot.
So
Is that a figure 16?
It's a multiple figure-8. So this is a very classic, again, a very classic knot. I didn't invent it. As I was playing with this knot, I was thinking algorithmically. I was thinking, okay, so the algorithm here is one turn around. So there's 2 legs inside the knots, foundational sort of chords, and the figure-8 is going around each once, and then make the multiple figure-8. So I was thinking about the algorithm, one turn, one turn, one turn, one turn. And I started thinking, what if you did 1 turn and then 2, and then 1, and then 2, and then 1, and then 2. So I started thinking about changing the algorithm. And indeed, what that turned out to look like was this. This knot I did invent.
Yeah.
So when you make 2 turns on one of the legs and only
but Wendy,
1 turn,
that looks so organic. So maybe plants do know how to make knots. I mean, doesn't it look?
It gets better. It gets better. So I was correct that when you do two turns around one leg and one turn around the other leg, the knot will naturally begin to spiral because there's more material on one of the legs, right? So then after inventing this one, I thought, well, what if I did this with 50 feet of rope? Would the knot continue to spiral around itself and not just create the half circle, which is really an unfinished spiral? And I experimented, and happily, that's what it became. So it's the corkscrew.
Oh, the DNA molecule knows how to knot itself.
The helix, yes. I'm very proud of this knot, and I get to claim it. So, yeah, so lots of ways to talk about it. It really was about starting with the classics, and then in the flow of the making, figuring it out. It's also sort of mathematical. It's creating the helix. I was playing with the algorithm.
And well, hey, that's amazing.
Isn't it great? Thank you.
No, but now immediately I want to apply that to the knotting of several videos together. How might we, what do you call it? You'll knot?
Well, the question becomes, why would you want to do that? Is it that you want to create a bend? You want to connect two videos together? Why would you, and I'm asking this, you know, just to understand, like, why would you, why do knots become part of your thinking here? Here's another example to aid in thinking. This is called a Flemish flake. So this is a knot, and there's no crossings in it. It's really smooth, and it's not straight, but there are no crossings in it. What makes it a knot? The fact that these complications were intentionally made this way. It's a spiral. Functionally, this knot is used on ship decks so that you can store rope in an untangled way, so that when you need the rope, you can just grab an end and unfurl it very quickly without it tangling. So sailors use Flemish flakes on ship decks, but there's no crossings in it. It's just the intention of the maker. But my question to you is, why not?
Why not? Why not? Not.
That's the author of that's the name of a really good book I have called Why Not? It's very cute.
Well, why not knots? But okay, so I'm going to have to leave the meeting. I have a meeting with a brilliant PhD student that's about to begin. And I would share her ideas with you, but I don't have time. But they, you know, a group of 3 students created some games where each game creates a fictional world. And obviously then they're playing against each other. And so then immediately listening to you, how did the games knot each other? And anyway, so I'll bring up the idea with her. So keep going. Our methodology in these meetings is people come and go. And so I will let you finish this, and I'll listen to the recording, Vanya.
But Roger, I mean, what you call knotting together the video, that is one way of expressing, to bring together videos, but there are many ways to put them together, which you don't call knot, but it is actually knotting them
Right,
together.
so, but I think Wendy's question is, why not, right? And so, you know, and this idea that we had of what would be a digital, virtual, multi-dimensional AIDS quilt, well, you know, why not? Because you don't want it to come apart.
That's lovely. So my understanding then is what you're asking about is how to connect them.
How to connect them using knot theory so that they cannot get separated again by themselves, obviously.
Well, that's lovely too. Yeah, and that's lovely too, to think about using the mathematical definition of knots, which are closed loops. So there really are no ends, so it really does not end.
Yeah, yeah. So, and that's part of the, you know, the idea behind how do we remember the people dying in the pandemic using, okay, I'm going to stop and leave, and Joel is going to jump in.
Thanks, Roger.
Thank you.
the thing that I would add to that is that what I would hope is that the discovery of whatever the algorithm is that's used reveals something to us that we weren't looking for or we didn't necessarily anticipate, and that results in not just a way of tying things together, but tying them together in a way that it emerges something that we weren't necessarily looking for. That makes sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the search for it, you know, if a form of nodding is the answer here, then and if the knot, you know, the concept of nodding adds extra layers of meaning and richness to the project, then the project benefits.
And it may end up not just being knot theory. It could be ties back into string theory and into,
Yeah.
you know, other complementary ways of thinking. And you know, clearly this is just so much at the front end of what of what we're trying to do. So first thing I would say is we're not trying to make an AIDS quilt.
Yeah.
I'm adamantly opposed to trying to kind of replicate that model. It kind of comes up as an analogy more than anything else. I think there's an opportunity here to construct something that otherwise could not be constructed. Given the proliferation of digital recording that's already available and out there, and both in terms of sound, visuals, and you know, multiple formats, and how we might approach the kind of I don't want to say communal, it may end up being communal, a kind of communal building of these things. So I was looking at a wiki page the other day of, you know, Roger's talking about the how do we remember the dead? Well, there's a wiki page where you just simply go and add the person's name, you know, and a link, and who it is, and you're done. And this thing could obviously grow to be millions of names long as a kind of record of who died. The New York Times also did a front page, you know, with all the names of the people who died in New York State.
Yeah.
That's not a very rich experiential way of understanding the condition, you know, and I mean, I think what's so wonderful about textiles and what you do, Wendy, is that it's so tangible, it's so there, it's so overt, and yet it's deeply informed by the algorithm and the mathematics and that understanding as well, although it's not specifically about that. So more than anything else, I'm just speaking for myself, this is a learning experience. And I so appreciate you taking some of your valuable time to spend with us, and hopefully, you know, this crazy conversation is something you'd maybe be willing to continue to have with us if we were to rope in a few other interesting people, just to kind of keep it going to see where it leads.
I would love to. Thank you for the invitation. I'd be honored.
Fantastic.
I'd like to say that for me, not making is a physical expression with an ancient history. I mean, you know, a long history of something which is a language, but it is many other things as well. And it's so complex and so simple at the same time that it's just mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I love it. Thank you for understanding, Nina. I appreciate that. I think it's such an amazing world. I could very happily, you know, continue exploring knots, I think, for the rest of my life, and never be bored or find, you know, my curiosity would be endlessly satisfied.
But I also admire you. And I admire you maybe because I am also on my third life, that to enter into a totally new area, to have the courage, because you need a lot of courage, because, you know, especially if you are a woman of a certain age. I mean, you are much younger than me. I'm not.
I don't think I am much younger than you, but yes.
There is a huge prejudice out there for women who are not young anymore and start to do something totally new. And
I agree.
So all the best to you.
Thank you. You know, I think about that issue all of the time. Thank you so much for bringing it up. You know, I think that the reason many of us don't move forward to do the things we most want to do in life is because of fear. And so it does take a lot of courage to make changes in your life. And I'm 53, so I don't think I'm very much younger than you are either.
Well, just for everyone's time here, I guess we bring this to a close. And Wendy, I'll circle back with you offline, and we can talk a bit further and
great
some suggestions. We have some ideas about some other folks that we might want to. Roger mentioned Linda Henderson as a person, which would be really interesting to have her in the conversation.
Yes.
And we are so committed to this idea of what I referred to as slow emergence. It's like, we're not in a hurry.
I love it.
We just want to let this thing kind of unfold and percolate, and if it finds legs, great. I mean,
I love it.
If it doesn't, we're still going to have some great conversations.
I love it. Thank you so much. I should probably run. I have another meeting I need to get to, but thank you. I can't wait for part 2. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Can you hang on for a second?
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay. So interesting, right?
Very.
Yeah, I quite like her. I think she was really
you know,
good.
and the fact that we get into these different worlds in with our conversations. I mean, this is so totally different than Jonathan Keats. I mean, it's very different, but it also takes a lot of courage, because he goes to an area which some people are laugh at or make fun of it, and some make.
Right.
So it's really, really great.
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean, I would love to hear Jonathan and her talk. You know what I mean?
We should do things like that. That's
I think we should.
That's provocation.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So I thought that was very rich, and I knew she didn't know exactly what she was getting into. I do think we need to leave more space for our guests to talk.
Yeah, I really think that's very important. It's just difficult because this is Roger's personality. And he's so used to it that he can jump in everything.
Yeah. We just do the best that we can.
But even so, it was rich.
Yeah. So I just wanted to ask, are we planning to have another meeting next week, or are we going to hold off? Did we decide?
I asked the kids in the book planning team to meet next Friday. I told them we usually meet at 1 p.m. Dallas time, and just one of them agreed to 1 p.m. I'm still waiting for them to tell me if they want to change the hour or something like that, but they all agreed to meet on Friday. So yeah.
But if you change anything, we have to know ahead.
Yes, for sure.
Because if we don't know ahead, we can't do it.
Yeah.
But it would be nice in anyhow to have a little meeting before the end of this year and just talk a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll plan to meet no matter next week. I just wanted to make
sure.
Okay, fantastic.
How is everything, before you go, Joel, how is everything? Because it is very strict at your place. How is it? How are you surviving?
Oh, we're doing fine. We're isolated at home, pretty much. The ICUs in the hospitals in the region are completely full. There's no more space for patients. They're stacking them up outside in ambulances. It's crazy. It's just awful. you know, we'll be in I think the lockdown will get more severe over the next week, and then it'll last at least until mid-January before we can start to emerge from it. It's just not good, and a lot of it just, you know, it's so sad because it could have been prevented in so many ways. It's just these crazy Americans doing the Thanksgiving holidays and going to bars, and it's just crazy. The people who are in denial.
And protest for a mask.
Exactly. It's mind-boggling.
Protest because people kill Black people, okay, I understand. But to protest for a mask, I can't understand. There's no way I can comprehend.
It's so beyond belief. I mean, most of the people in our community are very conscientious, but you know, there are so many. It's so demographically imbalanced because the Latino population in San Jose is about almost 60% of the cases are in that demographic, and most infections are in the 25 to 35-year-old range. Not necessarily the deaths, but it's disproportionate, and it's partly because there's so much. How to say it? The economy is so dependent upon the labor force that is necessary. That's a lot of the infections stemming from that, and it's complicated. I don't have any answers. I'm just depressed, staying home.
Yeah, I mean, we have lockdown here too, but you know, a lot of it is self-imposed as well.
Yeah.
So I'm getting ready. This will be the first Christmas when I sit alone at home with a bottle of wine or something.
It's so sad. I'm so sorry.
Well, there are much bigger problems than that.
Yeah.
Comparatively.
No, I
Thank you, Vanya, to listen to us all the time. And thank you for your voice. And thank you, Joel. And bye.
It's a pleasure
Okay.
to listen to you.
See you next week.
See you next week.
See you next week. Have a nice weekend.
Bye.